You are standing at the edge of an ancient harbor. The Mediterranean sun burns gently above you. The waves slap against time-worn piers, and fishermen mend their nets nearby. But your gaze doesn't stay with the men or the boats. Instead, your eyes trace downward toward the silent blocks beneath the water, the gray mixture that has held together for nearly 2,000 years. These structures, built by hands long turned to dust, are still here, still resisting the ocean's salt and fury, still refusing to crumble. This was Roman concrete, or as they called it, opus caementitium. It is not glamorous, like marble statues or golden mosaics. It does not carry the stories of emperors or wars. It is boring, stone dust, volcanic ash, lime, rubble. But in its very dullness lies its magic. Because, unlike so many marbles of the past, this one survived. And it continues to whisper a quiet question. How did they do it? When you imagine modern concrete, you may picture cement trucks spinning, gray slurry poured into molds, quick-drying mixtures hardened under the sun. But Roman concrete was different. At its core was a marriage between lime, burned limestone turned into quicklime, volcanic ash from places like Pozzuoli near Naples, and aggregate, stone rubble, brick fragments, even broken pottery. It sounds simple. In fact, it sounds primitive. But the Romans, through endless trial and error, found proportions that created chemical reactions still at work today. When their harbors touched seawater, the salt did not corrode the concrete, as it does ours. Instead, the water triggered new mineral growth inside the cracks. Tiny crystals of a rare mineral called aluminum tobermorite sprouted, filling the voids. What for us would be the slow death of concrete became, for the Romans, its second life. This was not brilliance born of one mind. It was centuries of masons, quarry workers, ash haulers, and builders who, without knowing the words crystal structure or chemical reaction, learned from watching walls that lasted and walls that crumbled. The boring work of observation, repeated and handed down, became a silent science. Picture the scale of effort. A Roman builder in the 2nd century BCE did not have cement plants or mechanical mixers. Instead, kilns for lime burned day and night, fueled by timber harvested from nearby forests. Slaves and laborers shoveled volcanic ash into baskets. Oxen pulled carts stacked with stone fragments. Each material had to be hauled to a construction site, sometimes across towns, sometimes across seas. The mixing was done by hand, in shallow pits or wooden troughs. Lime slaked in water hissed and steamed, men turning the paste with shovels until it cooled. Ash was sprinkled in, little by little, until it thickened into mortar. Then rubble was thrown in, and the mass was stirred, heaved, and shaped. It was not glamorous work. The men who bent their backs to it were often invisible in history, their names forgotten. But it was they who pressed this strange mixture into molds, packed it between stone facings, or poured it into wooden casings for piers. It was they who walked home at night with dust in their lungs and mortar caked into their fingernails. They did not know their labor would outlast marble palaces and emperors' names. But it did. Roman concrete wasn't just for harbors. It crept into every corner of the empire. Aqueducts, those long gray lines marching across valleys, are silent streams of this material. The Colosseum, where crowds once screamed, stands not only on marble but on concrete foundations. Bridges, still carrying travelers, rest on piers of the same mixture. But perhaps the most haunting use was in domestic architecture, in the quiet homes of Roman citizens. The walls of shops, the vaulted ceilings of bathhouses, the storage cisterns for water. These were not built to astonish. They were built to function. And yet, 2 millennia later, they still stand. The walls, patched and reused, became part of new medieval houses. Roman vaults, buried under dust, became basements for Renaissance palaces. The concrete blurred into the very landscapes of Europe. It is difficult for you, standing here in imagination, to separate what is ancient and what is modern. The material became part of time itself, as though the empire left not ruins, but a skeleton that cities still flesh out. If there was a secret ingredient, it was pozzolana, the volcanic ash from the Bay of Naples. Its color could be pale gray, yellow, or even reddish, but always it carried hidden power. When mixed with lime, it created a hydraulic cement. one that hardened underwater. This was revolutionary. Most ancient mortars dissolved when wet, but Roman harbors demanded durability. Ships unloaded grain from Egypt, wine from Gaul, silver from Spain. A crumbling pier meant hunger in the city of Rome. So the empire invested in boring, repetitive experiments with ash and lime until they found a blend that endured. Some historians suggest that the knowledge spread through military campaigns. Roman engineers, building forts and bridges, discovered local ashes worked differently. They adapted recipes to each region. A concrete wall in Gaul might be subtly unlike one in Judea. This was not a science written in books. It was a craft learned by hand, guarded by guilds and refined in silence. Imagine, for a moment, that you are not a historian but a worker in that age. The foreman calls your name at dawn. You join a team at the harbor. The air smells of salt and smoke from lime kilns. Your task is to carry baskets of ash from the cart to the mixing pit. The ash stings your eyes, dries your throat. Nearby, two men stand knee-deep in water, guiding wooden molds into place. Others shovel mortar into the frames, layer after layer, while oxen bellow at the weight of rubble-laden carts. You hear no speeches about empire or progress, just a rhythm of labor. Shovels scraping, carts creaking, waves slapping. By evening, your skin is coated in gray dust. You cough, spit black phlegm, and walk home. You do not know that the wall you built will one day stand when emperors' names are forgotten. To you, it is just a day's wage, another evening of sore muscles. When you look back now, from centuries later, the marvel is not that Rome built concrete walls. It is that those walls survived longer than the empire itself. The Western Empire collapsed in the 5th century CE, but the piers remained. Kingdoms rose, fell, and fought, but the aqueducts still carried water. In the Middle Ages, people often marveled at Roman ruins, calling them the works of giants. They had forgotten the recipe. Concrete became a mystery, a lost art. Builders returned to cut stone and mortar, slower and more fragile. For 1,000 years, no one matched the dull perfection of that mixture. And so, you stand again at the edge of the harbor, gazing down at the Roman pier. The secret lies not in the glory of emperors, but in lime, ash, stone, and water. A boring mixture made by forgotten workers. Yet here it is, immortal in silence. But as you watch, another question forms. Why, after centuries of progress, do we still struggle to recreate the very durability the Romans achieved at their humble ash and lime? When you think of Rome, you may picture the Colosseum, aqueducts, or temples. But the empire was vast, its borders stretching from the sands of North Africa to the cold rivers of Britain, from the Atlantic shores of Spain to the deserts of Syria. Within this enormous territory, Roman concrete spread like a silent language. Road stations in Gaul, forts in Britain, bathhouses in Spain, all carried its dull gray fingerprint. Not every structure was monumental. Many were utilitarian. Grain storage facilities, military barracks, drainage culverts. It was concrete strength, not its beauty, that made it indispensable. Consider the aqueduct at Segovia in Spain. Its graceful arches are built of cut stone, but beneath them lie mortar and concrete foundations. Or think of the humble cisterns carved into the hillsides of North Africa, lined with concrete that still holds back water after centuries. These places do not shout with grandeur. They murmur with persistence. By the height of imperial power, Rome's economy depended on concrete as much as on legions or laws. Grain from Egypt fed the city. Wine and olive oil flowed in amphorae across the seas. All of it passed through harbors held together by the same volcanic ash and lime. Imagine the logistics. Thousands of tons of wheat arriving yearly, stored in warehouses made of concrete. Ships unloading in basins reinforced with submerged Roman piers. Without these boring walls, the capital would have starved. And yet, no writer of the time gave long speeches about mortar. Cicero praised orators. Virgil sang of heroes. Pliny wrote of natural wonders. But few celebrated the gray glue that made empire possible. It was too ordinary, too dull to be poetry. Yet it was the dullness that held everything together. When the empire fractured in the 5th century CE, so too did did its knowledge networks. The guilds of builders dissolved, the kilns went cold, the trade routes for volcanic ash fell silent. In Western Europe, people built with cut stone and lime mortar once more. They could still make walls, vaults, cathedrals, but not the strange concrete that healed itself in water. The secret had been buried with the empire. Medieval chronicles describe ruins of aqueducts and amphitheaters as the work of giants or demons. Builders marveled at piers that stood unbroken, yet they lacked the recipe. To them, the material seemed almost supernatural. For nearly 1,000 years, Roman concrete became not a craft, but a mystery. It was only during the Renaissance, when scholars rediscovered Roman texts, that hints of the formula surfaced again. Writers like Vitruvius had left descriptions of building practices. Architects and engineers read his works. But translating words into working recipes was harder than expected. By the 16th and 17th centuries, European builders experimented with lime and ash once more. Some success came, but the full secret of the seawater reaction, the mineral growth inside cracks, was still hidden. Their mixtures often crumbled where Roman piers endured. Concrete remained a pale shadow of what it had been. Cathedrals rose in stone, palaces gleamed in marble, but the quiet, boring resilience of Roman mixtures stayed out of reach. It was not until the 18th and 19th centuries that concrete returned in force. The discovery of Portland cement in Britain gave engineers a new material to build canals, bridges, and later skyscrapers. It was strong, yes. Fast-drying, yes. But it was also brittle, prone to corrosion in salt water, doomed to weaken over decades. When modern scientists began studying Roman harbors in the 20th century, they realized something astonishing. The ancients had outperformed us. Our piers cracked and rusted within a century. Theirs grew stronger with age. Geologists sliced samples from Roman breakwaters and, under microscopes, saw strange crystal structures forming in the mortar. What looked like boring gray rubble was, in truth, a living material. The seawater fed it and it healed. Today, you can still walk among these survivors. In Ostia, Rome's ancient port, you can run your hand along concrete walls built before Christ. In Baiae, sunken piers still lie beneath the water, their shapes visible to divers. In Cosa, a harbor town north of Rome, submerged breakwaters still stretch against the tide. They do not sparkle like marble or glitter like mosaics. They are lumps of gray, scarred, encrusted with barnacles. Tourists walk past them quickly, but these lumps tell a story of endurance, of ordinary workers and forgotten recipes that triumphed over centuries. And so, we arrive at another question. If Roman concrete was so superior, why did history let it vanish? Was it the collapse of trade routes? The loss of volcanic ash supplies? The disinterest of medieval builders? Or was it simply the fate of all human knowledge? That what seems boring in one age may be the very thing that sustains civilizations in another? By now, you have stood in Roman harbors, walked along aqueducts, and gazed at battered piers that still hold back the sea. You've seen how ordinary lime, ash, and rubble form an immortal material. You've watched it spread across the empire, only to be forgotten when the empire itself collapsed. But the story doesn't end with forgetting. In the quiet laboratories of modern universities, Roman concrete has returned, not as a mystery, but as a model. Scientists have chipped away samples, heated them, ground them, examined their crystal lattices. What they discovered still feels almost magical, a material that heals itself. When cracks form in modern concrete, water seeps in, rebar rusts, and the structure weakens. Bridges collapse, highways must be replaced, skyscrapers need constant repair. But Roman concrete behaves differently. When seawater seeps into a crack, it triggers the lime and volcanic ash to react again, forming new minerals. The crack doesn't widen, it seals. In effect, Roman concrete does not resist time. It collaborates with it. It uses the very water that threatens to destroy it as a partner in survival. For you, living in a world of infrastructure failures and costly maintenance, this is almost unbelievable. Imagine highways that repair their own cracks, harbors that grow stronger with waves, cities where maintenance is measured in centuries, not decades. And yet, Even with this knowledge, modern builders rarely use Roman recipes. Why? Partly it is economics. Portland cement is cheap, quick to make, and easily standardized. Volcanic ash, in contrast, is not always nearby. It must be mined, transported, refined. In an age of speed and profit margins, durability is sacrificed for efficiency. There is also habit. The building industry is conservative, bound by codes and conventions. Engineers trust the materials they know, not the ones dug from forgotten harbors. Roman concrete is admired, but seldom imitated. It is ironic, isn't it? The ancients, working with baskets and ox carts, created walls that endure millennia. We, with factories and machines, often build structures that struggle to survive a century. The endurance of Roman concrete is more than a technical curiosity. It is a reminder of how history hides its treasures. What seems dull, ordinary, and unworthy of poetry may in fact be the skeleton of civilizations. When you walk in Rome, you notice marble columns, bronze statues, painted frescoes. But it is the gray mass beneath the boring concrete that keeps those monuments upright. In your own life, too, perhaps it is not the glittering moments that endure, but the quiet, durable habits. The small, repetitive acts that build foundations. Roman concrete whispers this lesson. Strength is not always in brilliance, but in persistence. Return once more, in imagination, to that ancient pier. The sun is setting. The waves slap gently against the stones, and fishermen pull their boats ashore. The wall beneath the water is scarred, battered, worn, but it stands. It has stood for 2,000 years. It may stand for 2,000 more. And as you gaze at it, the final question lingers in your mind. What other secrets, hidden in the dull details of history, still wait to be rediscovered? Before Rome, before aqueducts and colosseums, there was Persia, the Achaemenid Empire, founded by Cyrus the Great in the 6th century BCE, stretched across nearly 3 million square miles. From the Indus Valley in the east to the Aegean Sea in the west, it was a patchwork of peoples, languages, and landscapes. Holding it together was no small task. And so, the Persians built roads. Not roads in the sense of quaint dirt tracks between villages, but vast, deliberate arteries of empire. The most famous of them, the Royal Road, ran for more than 1,500 miles, from Sardis in western Anatolia to Susa near the Persian Gulf. It was not a road of beauty. No triumphal arches lined it, no gleaming stones. It was dirt, gravel, tamped earth, and packed clay. In short, boring. But this boring road stitched together the empire's beating heart. Herodotus tells us that Persian couriers could ride the length of this road in astonishing speed. What might take an ordinary traveler 90 days could be done in less than 10 by royal messengers. The system was simple but effective. At intervals of about 15 miles stood relay stations, rest stops where a fresh horse and rider waited. A courier would gallop in, hand over the royal dispatch, and another horseman would thunder out, carrying the message onward. Day and night, through heat and rain, the relay system never stopped. The Persians had a phrase for it, one echoed centuries later in the motto of postal services. Neither snow nor rain nor heat nor gloom of night stays these couriers from the swift completion of their appointed rounds. The road was not glamorous. It was dusty, monotonous, and endless, but it allowed an emperor in Persepolis to send his words across mountains, rivers, and plains to the farthest satrapies. The royal road was not just for messengers. Governors, called satraps, used it to administer their provinces. Soldiers marched along it to quell revolts. Tax collectors rode it to carry silver back to the capital. Picture it. A line of soldiers trudging through Anatolian hills, sandals worn thin, their shadows stretching long in the evening sun. Behind them, ox carts creak with sacks of grain or chests of coin. The road itself offers no comfort, just dust and stones, but it binds them to the empire. Without such roads, Persia would have fractured under its own size. With them, it became one of the most connected realms of the ancient world. And what of the common man? Imagine a merchant from Babylon making his way to Sardis. He ties up his sandals, shoulders a pack of textiles, and begins a long march. The journey is not romantic. He sleeps in crowded roadside inns, eats dry bread, fears bandits in lonely stretches. Yet he takes comfort in knowing that the road exists. It has markers, stations, and patrols. It is safer than wandering through uncharted paths. For him, the dull regularity of the road is its greatest gift. He can follow it mile after mile, each station a reassurance that he is still within the Empire's embrace. A road is a simple thing, yet it is also a symbol. The Persian royal road declared, "This land is ours. These miles belong to the king. This dust carries his will." To you, standing centuries later, it may seem ordinary, a stretch of dirt long buried, but in its time, it was revolutionary. For the first time, millions of people scattered across vast lands could feel connected by a common thread. It is easy to marvel at palaces or armies, but perhaps the true power of Persia lay not in gold or spears, but in the quiet endurance of tamped earth beneath countless footsteps. And so, as night falls on the royal road, a courier gallops past, torchlight flickering, dust rising in his wake. The inns glow faintly with oil lamps. Merchants sleep, soldiers mutter, and the road stretches on into darkness. But as you imagine this endless artery, you must wonder, did the Empire control the road, or did the road control the Empire? A road does not remain a road without care. Rain washes away earth, wheels carve ruts into gravel, floods sweep bridges downstream. If the Persian royal road endured, it was not because it was built once and forgotten, but because men nameless uncelebrated maintained it day after day. Picture gangs of laborers clearing fallen stones from the path. Imagine peasants pressed into service, filling potholes with baskets of clay and gravel, along river crossings. Carpenters patched wooden bridges, their hammers echoing into the valleys. They were not praised by poets. Their work did not make inscriptions, but their dull, repetitive toil was the silent heartbeat that kept the Empire stitched together. Every 15 miles, like beads on a necklace, sat the relay stations. These were more than stables for horses. They were miniature worlds. Each station housed grooms of the animals, scribes for messages, guards for protection, and cooks for travelers. The smell of dung, sweat, and boiled grain clung to the air. Horses stamped and neighed in the darkness, ready for the next rider. A tired courier might gulp down bread and dates before collapsing on a cot for an hour of sleep, only to be roused again. To the casual traveler, the stations offered a kind of safety. To the Empire, they were lifelines, each one a spark that kept the chain of communication unbroken. You may imagine taxes as scrolls and seals, neat entries in ledgers. But in Persia, taxes often moved as cargo. Silver talents piled into ox carts, grain packed into clay jars, wool, wine, incense, all loaded onto caravans and pushed along the royal road toward imperial centers. It was tedious, slow, and vulnerable. A broken axle could halt an entire train. Rain could turn dust into mud, swallowing wheels. Yet, step by step, the Empire's wealth trickled across the road, feeding treasuries and armies. Think of the guards trudging alongside, sandals worn flat, spears dull from dust. For them, this road was not a marvel. It was endless labor, a march that never ended. To walk the royal road was not to see wonders, but to see sameness. Station after station, mile after mile, dust rising in the sun, mud pooling in the rain. Days blurred into weeks, weeks into months. Yet this monotony was precisely its strength. A merchant knew he could find water. A soldier knew he could find shelter. A courier knew he could find a fresh horse. The road's dull predictability was its gift. The assurance that, though the Empire was vast, it was navigable. In the boring sameness lay security. The road also became the eyes and ears of the king. Messages of rebellion, whispers of famine, requests for aid, all rushed along its path. When a satrap in Anatolia hesitated to send taxes, word reached Persepolis swiftly. When a revolt stirred in Egypt, soldiers were dispatched before flames spread. The road amplified the emperor's presence. Even in distant villages, farmers felt the weight of royal power because messengers could arrive at any hour. It was not walls or armies alone that held Persia together. It was this dusty artery, carrying not just goods, but authority. But such control came at a cost. Roads are double-edged. They carry soldiers outward, but they also carry rebels inward. They spread royal decrees, but also rumors. Imagine a band of thieves ambushing a caravan, disappearing into hills, only to vanish along the very road that bound the empire. Or imagine a courier carrying treasonous words instead of royal orders. The road was power, but it was also vulnerability. And so, under the endless sun, the royal road stretches on. Laborers patching holes, merchants trudging with goods, couriers galloping from station to station. Dust rises, settles, and rises again. It is easy to admire the grand palaces of Persepolis. But perhaps the empire's true foundation lay here, in tamped earth and endless monotony. Yet the question lingers. Did the royal road make the empire stronger, or did it quietly wear it down with the weight of its own demands? No empire lasts forever. The Achaemenids, who had stitched Asia together with the royal road, fell to Alexander of Macedon in the 4th century BCE. His armies thundered along the same path that Persian couriers once galloped. Where messages once flowed from Persepolis, Greek war cries echoed instead. The road endured, but the hands that ruled it changed. Seleucid kings, then Parthians, then Sasanians, all walked the same earth. Each empire patched it, taxed it, and marched their soldiers along it. But none could make it eternal. Floods washed away bridges. Relay stations crumbled, and stretches of road returned to dust. By the Middle Ages, parts of it were forgotten entirely, swallowed by villages, fields, and silence. And yet, it never vanished completely. Even today, archaeologists trace its ghosts across Turkey, Iran, and Iraq. A curve of packed earth here, a buried foundation of a station there. Shepherds still lead flocks across fragments once trodden by royal couriers. Farmers plow fields along forgotten spine. The royal road did not vanish so much as it dissolved into landscape, becoming part of the very soil it once commanded. The lesson is almost too simple. Empires rise, empires fall, but roads endure. Rome would later copy this principle, paving thousands of miles of stone roads that still cut across Europe. The Mongols would create their own courier networks on horseback, galloping across the steppe. Even in modern times, nations measure their strength not only in armies, but in highways, railroads, and flight paths. Every empire, it seems, has its royal road, the dull but vital infrastructure that carries its lifeblood. Think of your world now. Trucks hum along interstates. Trains screech through tunnels. Airplanes trace invisible paths through the sky. To you, these are ordinary, even boring, but they are the arteries of your civilization. The Persian royal road whispers across time. What feels dull today may one day be remembered as the very thing that held a world together. Imagine again a courier, 2,500 years ago, galloping under the starlight. His horse's hooves strike sparks on the packed road. His breath comes in gasps. His satchel holds a message from a king. He is not thinking of history. He is thinking of fatigue, of the next station, of bread and water. And yet without him, without the road, without the thousands of others who trudged and built and patched, the empire would have splintered into silence. The grandeur of Persepolis, the gold of the treasury, the victories of the armies, all depended on dust and tamp clay beneath weary feet. And so the royal road fades into the darkness of history. Its stones are broken, its stations are ruins, its couriers long gone, but its idea endures. The quiet power connection, the dull strength of roads. The question it leaves is simple and perhaps unanswerable. Do empires shape their roads, or do their roads shape the empires? You pinch a few grains between your fingers. They glisten faintly, dry and ordinary. Salt, nothing more than seasoning for bread, dust for preserving fish. Yet for most of human history, salt was not ordinary. It was treasure. It was white gold. Salt preserved meat through winters, kept fish edible across voyages, and flavored otherwise bland diets. Without it, armies could not march, sailors could not travel, and cities could not endure lean years. And so, from China to Africa to Europe, salt became the quiet backbone of survival. It is easy to forget this now, when packets that sit unnoticed in every kitchen. But once, salt was wealth, and men were willing to pay dearly for it. Even in the earliest civilizations, salt left its trace. In Mesopotamia, tablets record rations of salt given to workers. In Egypt, salt from desert lakes preserved the flesh of mummies, ensuring the dead endured as surely as the pyramids. In China, dynasties rose on the control of salt. Taxes on it filled treasuries, funding armies and palaces. In Africa, caravans crossed the Sahara with slabs of salt strapped to camels, traded ounce for ounce with gold. In medieval Europe, entire towns existed because of salt mines, their boring shafts and brine pans producing the crystals that kept populations alive. Salt was not dramatic like gold or silver. It was not glorious like bronze weapons or marble statues. But it was necessary, and necessity is the deepest form of power. Rulers understood this power, and they exploited it. Salt taxes appear again and again in history as reliable revenue streams for kings and emperors. In France, the gabelle, a salt tax, became one of the most hated levies in the kingdom. Peasants groaned under its weight. Smuggling and rebellion followed. Some historians trace the anger that fueled the French Revolution directly back to salt. In China, dynasties maintained monopolies on salt production. By fixing its price, they ensured a steady flow of income. The salt tax was so dependable that one scholar called it the sinew of the state. This is the dull face of empire, not battles or crowns, but account books filled with grainy white crystals, tallied and taxed. The demand for salt-carved roads across continents. In Africa, the trans-Saharan trade routes carried slabs from salt mines like Tagaza to markets on the Niger River. Caravans stretched for miles, camels plodding step by step, each carrying hundreds of pounds of mineral. Traders exchanged it for gold, ivory, and slaves. In Europe, salt roads linked inland towns to coastal sources. The Via Salaria in Italy, for example, was one of Rome's earliest roads, dedicated entirely to the movement of salt. Soldiers marched along it, merchants trundled carts, peasants walked barefoot, all because their bodies required what those crystals provided. Salt did not glitter like gold, but it compelled movement, shaped trade, and bound cities together. At its simplest, salt meant survival. Before refrigeration, it was the only reliable way to preserve food. A fisherman in the Baltic salted his catch to sell inland. A peasant in China rubbed salt into pork to last through winter. A caravan merchant salted camel meat to endure the desert crossing. The taste of salt was the taste of security. A family with salt could eat tomorrow. A soldier with salted rations could march farther. A city with salt warehouses could withstand siege. Think of the countless hands sprinkling salt across flesh, the endless repetition of rubbing it into fish, pork, beef. It was dull, mechanical work, yet it decided whether people lived or starved. Salt also revealed class. The wealthy flavored delicacies with fine, sifted salt. The poor made do with coarse, dirty crystals. At noble tables, ornate salt cellars stood as symbols of status. Guests seated above the salt were honored, those below the salt were lesser. It was quite literally a measure of one's place in society. The dull grains became tokens of hierarchy. Even religion turned its gaze to salt. In the Bible, Lot's wife became a pillar of it. Covenants were sealed with it. Offerings included it. In Hindu rituals, salt was used for purification. In Shinto practice, it warded off evil spirits. Salt was not sacred in the way gold idols were, but was present, constant, woven into rites because it was woven into life. Faith often clings to what people cannot live without. And so you hold the grains again, watching them slip through your fingers. They are silent, tasteless on their own, forgettable. But in them lies the survival of armies, the anger of peasants, the funding of empires. It makes you wonder, if something as dull as salt could shape revolutions, what other ordinary necessities are quietly ruling our lives today? Salt was not just food, it was leverage. When rulers controlled salt, they controlled survival itself. A kingdom could not force every farmer to sell wheat at a fixed price, but it could seize the salt mines, regulate brine pans, and dictate who could sell the mineral that every man, woman, and child required to live. This control turned salt into chains, invisible but unbreakable. A peasant might protest against grain levies or land rents, but without salt he simply could not endure. Perhaps the most infamous salt tax in history was France's gabelle. Beginning in the 14th century, the monarchy imposed strict regulations on salt production and sale. Each region was forced to buy fixed quantities at inflated prices, regardless of need. Peasants hated it. Smuggling flourished. Families boiled seawater in secret cauldrons, scraping crystals from the edges under cover of night. Bands of smugglers carried contraband salt across provincial borders, pursued by royal guards. To the crown, the gabelle was indispensable. It provided steady income, funding wars and palaces. To the people, it was oppression crystallized. By the 18th century, resentment of the salt tax had grown so bitter that it helped fuel the French Revolution. It is striking, isn't it? A mineral so dull, so ordinary, could carry within it the spark of revolt. On the other side of the world, Chinese dynasties perfected salt monopolies over centuries. The state managed mines, brine wells, and distribution networks. Licenses were granted, prices fixed, taxes extracted. The system was bureaucratic, dull in its records and ledgers, but astonishingly effective. At times, the salt tax made up over half of the government's revenue. Whole armies were funded by brine, but corruption thrived as well. Officials took bribes, smugglers operated shadow markets, and regions without access to legal salt often relied on a legal trade. For peasants, salt was not just food, it was a symbol of the state's constant grip. Imagine yourself as a salt smuggler in 18th century France. You rise before dawn, slipping into the marshes to collect brine illegally. Your family waits nervously at home, hoping the guards do not find you. You strap sacks of salt onto a mule and travel narrow woodland paths, avoiding patrols. If caught, punishment is severe. Fines, prison, even execution for repeat offenders. And yet you risk it, because without smuggled salt, the poor cannot afford to preserve meat through winter. Without it, families starve. Smuggling was not glamorous. It was desperate, dangerous, and dull, but it was also an act of survival against an empire of taxes. Again and again, salt became the seat of uprisings. In China, riots broke out when prices were fixed too high. In India, under British colonial rule, the salt tax became a symbol of foreign oppression. Centuries later, Gandhi's Salt March in 1930, an act of quiet defiance against the British monopoly, would ignite the independence movement. The march was simple. Men and women walked to the sea and collected salt. No weapons, no armies, just hands reaching into brine, reclaiming what the earth gave freely. And yet that act shook an empire. Salt, boring and overlooked, once again proved more powerful than crowns and cannons. For rulers, salt appeared in ledgers, weights, prices, revenue streams. For common people, salt appeared in kitchens, a pinch on bread, a cure for fish, a rub for pork. This dual life, part bureaucratic, part domestic, gave salt its unique hold. Kings could not ignore it, neither could peasants. The mineral existed at the intersection of power and hunger. In its dull grains lay both sustenance and rebellion. And so you watch as tax collectors tally salt. Smugglers risk their lives. Peasants grumble over their meals. You see empires rise on its revenue and fall under the weight of its taxes. The question whispers, is true power in the hands of kings, or in the crystals that silently decide who eats and who starves? For thousands of years, salt had ruled silently, its crystals glittering not just on tables, but in treasuries and laws. Yet by the 19th century, its throne began to crumble. The change was technological. Refrigeration arrived. Canning was perfected. Railroads made food transport faster and cheaper. Suddenly, salt was no longer the sole guardian of preservation. Meat could be chilled. Fish could be shipped in ice. Grain could travel quickly before spoiling. The monopoly of necessity was broken. Salt remained important, still seasoning bread, still preserving foods in places without modern machines, but it was no longer an empire maker. Yet salt did not vanish. Instead, it retreated into smaller roles, quiet, constant, still essential. Pickling remained a craft. Salted cod continued to feed Mediterranean kitchens. Cured ham still hung in smokehouses. Even when refrigeration took over, people did not abandon salt completely. They clung to it, Not just a utility, but for taste, for tradition, for memory. The mineral that once determined survival became a flavor of culture. Think about your own table today. A small shaker sits unnoticed beside your plate. You turn its cap, sprinkle a little, and move on without thought. No guards watch over it. No smugglers risk lives to deliver it. No peasants rebel because of it. Salt has become, finally, ordinary, cheap, common, invisible. The drama is gone. And perhaps that is the strangest twist of all, that something which once toppled empires now hides in paper packets at fast food counters. Yet if you listen closely, salt's echo remains. In the ruins of Tagaza in the Sahara, the abandoned salt pits stretch on the sun. In the archives of France, ledgers of the Gabelle still carry angry numbers. In India, Gandhi's footsteps along the coast still mark the defiance of people. Salt may be ordinary now, but its history is anything but. For millennia, these dull crystals carried hunger, wealth, revolt, and power. They were the skeleton of survival, the lifeblood of trade, the silent fuel of revolutions. So you hold the grains once more, letting them slip through your fingers into the fire. They hiss faintly, then vanish. It is hard to imagine that these same crystals once determined the fate of kings. And as you think on it, another question lingers. What other ordinary objects around you, ignored, overlooked, taken for granted, are quietly shaping the destiny of your own world? The Roman Empire fell in the West, and with it, much of Europe's urban life unraveled. Roads crumbled, aqueducts dried, schools vanished. For centuries, invasions swept across the land. Visigoths, Vandals, Franks, Saxons. The flame of literacy dimmed. Yet in this landscape of ruin and silence, a different kind of empire emerged. One of monks' cloisters and libraries. While cities faltered, monasteries grew. While nobles fought, monks wrote. They did not march with swords. They sat with quills. And in their dull, repetitive work, they preserved much of what the ancient world had to give. Picture a monastery in the 9th century. The bells mark the hours. Monks rise before dawn, their breath steaming in the cold. They shuffle into the chapel for prayers, their voices murmuring chants that echo against stone walls. After meals of bread and broth, some walk to the fields, others to the kitchens. But a chosen few enter the scriptorium. This is no grand hall, just a room with wooden desks, oil lamps, and parchment laid out. Here, silence is law. A monk dips a quill in ink, bends over his page, and begins. Stroke by stroke, letter by letter, he copies a text. It might be the Gospels, the Psalms, or the works of Augustine. But sometimes, quietly, almost accidentally, it is a scrap of Aristotle, a fragment of Virgil, a tract of medicine, a Roman law code. The work is not fast. One book may take months, even years. Mistakes must be scraped off with a knife. Ink smudges are to be avoided at all costs. The monk labors with aching shoulders, failing eyesight, and frozen fingers in winter. It is, by any measure, boring work, but it is also the scaffolding of history. It is easy to imagine the Middle Ages as a time of darkness, but that image is misleading. Knowledge did not vanish. It was carried into monasteries, bound into parchment, stacked on wooden shelves. Consider the Irish monasteries, perched on windswept cliffs, where monks copied Latin texts while waves thunder below, or the Benedictine houses in Italy and France, where libraries grew year by year. Without them, much of Greek and Roman learning would have vanished entirely. Geometry, medicine, rhetoric, law, all passed to the hands of silent men who thought only of obedience, not a history. A book was not just words. It was also matter. Parchment, made from stretched animal skins, had to be scraped smooth with pumice. Ink, brewed from oak galls, iron salts, and wine, had to be mixed carefully to avoid fading. Covers were stitched from leather, boards carved from wood, clasps hammered from brass. Each volume was an object of immense labor. Dozens of sheep gave their hides for a single Bible. Days of boiling, stretching, drying, and scraping went into each sheet. Copying a book was not only mental work, it was physical industry. And so, the library became a treasury of both knowledge and material. Shelves grown not with gold, but with parchment. To steal a book was as grave as stealing cattle. The silence of the library was more than discipline. It was a philosophy. To copy was to submit, to obey, to let the word of God, or the ancients, flow through you. Talking was forbidden. Movement was measured. Even the scratch of the quill became part of the liturgy. For the monks, silence was not emptiness. It was order. It was a way to make space for the eternal. In that silence, knowledge survived. And so you stand in the scriptorium, watching the dim light flicker on parchment. A monk bends over his desk, ink staining his fingertips, lips moving silently as he forms each letter. He will not finish this book in his lifetime. He may not even see it read. Yet he writes anyway, line after line, hour after hour. And you are left to wonder, did the monks preserve knowledge for us, or did they preserve it only for God? And we were accidental heirs? A monastery rarely began with shelves full of books. At first, there might only be a single Bible, perhaps a psalter or a prayer book. But as decades passed and copying continued, the collection grew. One monk might copy the Gospels. Another might labor through Augustine's City of God. Still another might carefully transcribe a text on farming or medicine, simply because it was useful to the community. Slowly, patiently, volume by volume, a library was born. The shelves filled not with masterpieces, but with necessities, homilies, hymnals, law codes, commentaries, calendars of saints. And hidden among them, almost by accident, a fragment of Cicero, a tract of Aristotle, a history of Livy. The monks were not consciously preserving civilization. They were obeying their abbots, copying what was needed. The survival of antiquity was, in many ways, a byproduct of obedience. As libraries grew, so did the need for order. Monasteries developed primitive catalogs, lists of books scratched into wax tablets or parchment rolls. Some divided works by subject, scripture, law, philosophy, medicine, others by author. Borrowing was rare and strictly regulated. A monk might be allowed to carry a volume into his cell for private reading, but every book was accounted for. To lose one was a grave offense. Some monasteries even chained their most valuable manuscripts to desks, ensuring they could be read but never removed. The dull bureaucracy of lists, locks, and chains may seem tedious, but it was precisely this tedium that prevented loss. Copying was not free. It required parchment, ink, and hours of labor. Monasteries therefore invested in what might be called a copying economy. Wealthier houses would hire scribes or accept commissions from nobles. A lord might request a psalter for his chapel, paying in land or coin. The monastery gained both wealth and a copy of the book for its shelves. In this way, the spread of books was linked to the spread of patronage. Behind every manuscript lay not just a monk with a quill, but also a patron who financed the labor. Knowledge survived not by accident, but through the dull machinery of contracts, donations, and payments. A book, once copied, was not eternal. Parchment warped in damp. Ink faded in sunlight. Mice gnawed on bindings. Fire and flood could erase centuries in an hour. So monks became caretakers as well as copyists. They aired manuscripts in dry weather, repaired fraying bindings with thread, patched holes with scraps of parchment. They built libraries with small windows, thick walls, and careful ventilation. This daily vigilance was unromantic. It was cleaning, patching, and fussing. But without it, entire centuries of human thought would have turned to dust. Imagine a young monk assigned to the library. His days are predictable. In the morning, he checks the shelves for damp. He rubs mildew from a cover. He sharpens knives for scraping parchment. In the afternoon, he writes catalog entries or copies marginal notes. In the evening, he locks the library door with iron keys. He does this not for one day or 1 year, but for decades. He will die, his place taken by another who repeats the same motions. To the outside world, this is drudgery, but in its monotony lies strength. Knowledge survived not because of brilliance, but because of patience. When you step back, you see the true marvel is not that monks preserved great works. It is that they preserved anything at all. The survival of ancient texts depended not on dramatic rescues or heroic deeds, but on centuries of dull cataloging, repairing, and copying. Civilization was carried forward not by kings, but by librarians. So you imagine yourself in the library, oil lamps flickering, dust rising in the air. The silence is so deep that you hear the scratching of quills like tiny insects. Shelves loom, filled with manuscripts, each one the result of decades of tedium. And you wonder, is history built by brilliance or by the quiet persistence of those willing to do boring work day after day? Centuries passed. Outside monastery walls, kingdoms rose and fell. Plagues swept across Europe. Villages burned, castles crumbled, dynasties ended. For most people, life was short and uncertain. But within the libraries, time stretched differently. There, parchment endured. The works of Aristotle, Galen, Cicero, Augustine, names nearly forgotten in the wider world, remained in quiet rows. Not every text survived. Many were lost forever. But enough endured to form a fragile thread connecting antiquity to the future. In the 9th century, under Charlemagne, a revival of learning stirred. His scholars, like Alcuin of York, turned to monastic libraries for material. They found ancient texts, recopied them, and spread them across new schools. Without monasteries, this revival would have been impossible. Later, in the 12th and 13th centuries, as universities emerged in Paris, Bologna, and Oxford, scholars again turned to the monks. They borrowed manuscripts, studied Aristotle, pored over Roman law. The new knowledge that fueled Europe's intellectual awakening was, in truth, knowledge patiently shelved for centuries in monastic silence. By the 15th century, the invention of the printing press scattered knowledge like never before. Books poured from presses in Venice, Mainz, and Paris. But the raw material for this revolution came from manuscripts preserved in cloisters. When Petrarch read Cicero, when Erasmus studied the New Testament in Greek, when Galileo wrestled with Aristotle, each was touching words that might have vanished had some anonymous monk not copied them 1,000 years earlier. The Renaissance was a blaze of brilliance, but its fuel was centuries of boredom. The monks did not set out to save civilization. Their aim was obedience, devotion, and repetition. They copied because their abbots told them to. They preserved because routine demanded it. The survival of texts was, in a sense, accidental. And yet, in that accident lies the irony. The brilliance of modern science, philosophy, and art was built on the dullest of labors. Civilization owes as much to monotony as to genius. Even now, fragments of those manuscripts remain. In the Vatican Library, in Oxford's Bodleian, in monasteries across Europe. You can still find volumes written by hand centuries ago. The ink has faded, the parchment yellowed, but the words endure. Tourists may find them unremarkable, just rows of brown books. But each is a survivor, a bridge from worlds long gone. Step back, and you see the pattern. History is not only shaped by battles, kings, or inventions. It is also shaped by those who guard memory quietly. The monk's silence became civilization's echo. For you, in a world drowning in information, perhaps the lesson is this. The future will not be decided only by who creates knowledge, but by who preserves it, catalogs it, and carries it forward. And so you sit in the monastery library, surrounded by oil lamps and parchment, the air thick with dust. You hear the scratch of quills, the shuffle of sandals, the turning of pages, and you wonder, was it the brilliance of the ancients that reached us, or the silence of the monks that allowed it to survive? When you think of history's monuments, you may imagine the pyramids, the Great Wall, the Colosseum. Bridges rarely come to mind. They do not dazzle like palaces or inspire awe like cathedrals. They are humble connectors, built to get you from one side to another. And yet, many still stand, carrying weight they were never meant to bear, whispering stories that history books ignore. Across Europe and Asia, bridges built by Romans, medieval masons, and anonymous laborers still serve daily life. Cars rush across them. Farmers lead animals over them. Children play on them, rarely noticing that the stones beneath their feet were set centuries ago. These are the monuments of boredom, practical, silent, uncelebrated. And yet, in their dull endurance, they outlast empires. Take, for example, the Pont du Gard in southern France. Built in the 1st century CE, it is often called an aqueduct, but its massive arches also serve as a bridge. For nearly 2,000 years, it has spanned the Gardon River, weathering floods and storms. Its secret is the arch Romans perfected this design, where stones press against each other so tightly that the whole structure grows stronger under pressure. No mortar binds the central stones, only gravity and geometry. Think of the workers who hauled those blocks into place, sweating under the Mediterranean sun. They could not know that their arches would survive for millennia, still admired by tourists, still standing as lorries rumble nearby on modern roads. It is not the glory of Caesar that endures, but the dull precision of masons laying stones. In medieval Europe, monks often built bridges near monasteries to aid pilgrims and merchants. These were not grand, just narrow spans of stone over creeks or rivers. Yet many still exist, tucked away in forests or beside forgotten villages. Walk across one today, and you may feel little. The stones are uneven, the moss thick, the air silent. But remember, for centuries, these bridges were lifelines. They carried farmers to markets, soldiers to campaigns, monks to neighboring abbeys. The bridges were part of an economy of survival, not glory. Built to serve, not to impress. Their builders did not inscribe their names. And so the bridges endure while the men are forgotten. Beyond Europe, bridges serve empires of commerce. In China, stone arch bridges carried silk and tea along the great trade routes. In India, step bridges linked riverbanks for caravans of salt and spices. In the Ottoman Empire, master builder Mimar Sinan designed bridges that still carry traffic in the Balkans today. They were not meant as monuments. They were meant as passage. But sometimes the most boring work endures longest. Imagine a farmer in the 15th century. He wakes before dawn, straps grain sacks to a mule, and leads it toward the market. He crosses the same stone bridge his grandfather did, its arches rising quietly in the morning mist. The stones are slippery, worn smooth by generations. He does not think of the bridge as marvel. It is simply there, part of the world like the river itself. And yet, centuries later, that same bridge will still be there, carrying tourist buses, or perhaps just the footsteps of another farmer. The bridge outlives every man who walks upon it. So you stand on such a bridge today, moss underfoot, arches stretching beneath you. Cars pass, tourists snap photos, children skip stones in the river. The bridge does not boast. It does not tell you who built it. It simply serves. And you wonder, are the true monuments of history the ones that dazzle us, or the ones that quietly keep carrying us forward? A bridge is never truly completed. Left alone, water will erode its piers, floods will scour its foundations, wind and frost will crack its stones. Every bridge that still stands today has survived because generation after generation patched, repaired, and reinforced it. This work was rarely glamorous. There were no celebrations for a mason who replaced a stone, or for peasants who cleared silt from an arch. And yet, without them, the bridge would have fallen long ago. Survival is never passive. It is built out of dull, repetitive care. In medieval Europe, towns often collected tolls specifically to maintain bridges. Travelers might pay a few coins across, with the money funding masons and carpenters. At times, entire guilds were formed, fraternities of the bridge, dedicated solely to upkeep. Picture them, men in coarse tunics, hauling stones from quarries, hammering wedges into old mortar, wading waist-deep in freezing rivers to clear debris. The work was dirty and dangerous, but essential. Most of their names are gone, their efforts unrecorded. But every surviving medieval bridge is, in truth, a palimpsest, a surface constantly rewritten by centuries of anonymous hands. Water was always the enemy. Floods could strip foundations bare overnight, carrying stones downstream like pebbles. Ice in winter widened cracks. Sediment piled against piers, redirecting currents, threatening collapse. To counter this, caretakers built cofferdams, temporary walls to dry out foundations for repair. They packed gravel and timber around bases, layering stone upon stone to thicken piers. After every storm, inspections had to be made. It was endless work because rivers never slept, and so neither could those who cared for bridges. Maintenance was not only physical, but financial. Bridges demanded revenue streams. Toll collectors stood at gates, recording wagons, weighing goods, collecting copper or silver. To the traveler, it was a nuisance. To the town, it was survival. Ledgers from medieval France, Italy, and England showed detailed accounts of tolls spent on repairing specific arches or paying carpenters for scaffolding. The numbers are dull, but they are the numbers that ensured stones kept standing. In this sense, every bridge that survives is also a monument to bureaucracy, the ink on parchment that kept workers paid and projects funded. Consider again the farmer crossing a bridge with his mule. He does not know that last spring, a mason replaced stones washed away in a flood. He does not see the scaffolding that hung over the river, the men clinging to ropes with chisels and hammers. He does not know that a toll he paid last year helped purchase oak beams to shore up a pier. For him, the bridge simply exists. But in truth, it is an ongoing collaboration between past and present. Centuries of men whose boring labor was invisible, but without which the crossing would collapse. The remarkable thing about old bridges is not that they were brilliantly designed, though many were. It is that societies had the patience to maintain them for centuries. One flood, one war, one decade of neglect could have erased them. Instead, they endured because people kept showing up with stones, mortar, tools, and time. It is, in many ways, the same patience that keeps civilizations alive. Not sudden bursts of genius, but steady hands that mend, repair, and sustain. And so you stand by the river, watching water swirl around mossy piers. You see the stones, dark with age, still carrying carts and cars. You know they're survivors not of one age, but of dozens. And you ask yourself, is the endurance of history built by the brilliance of those who first created, or by the generations of caretakers who refuse to let it die? Every empire leaves monuments. Some fade quickly, palaces abandoned, fortresses toppled. But bridges, oddly, endure. When Rome fell, its army scattered and its cities shrank. Yet its bridges continued to carry peasants and traders. When medieval kingdoms dissolved, their cathedrals sometimes burned, but their bridges still cross rivers. The secret is their purpose. A palace is for a king. A cathedral is for worship. But a bridge is for everyone. It is too useful to be abandoned. And so, when rulers change, bridges were patched, reused, and renamed, but rarely destroyed. Think of a stone bridge in rural Spain, built under Rome, repaired under Moors, patched again under medieval kings. Today, cars come across it. Few drivers pause to notice. But beneath their wheels lies a continuous thread of 2,000 years. The bridge has witnessed soldiers marching, pilgrims walking, merchants pushing carts. It has seen floods, droughts, plagues, wars. And still it serves, indifferent to history's noise. Bridges are in their way, witnesses, silent, reliable, patient. A bridge is not just stone. It is the idea of connection, of joining two sides that would otherwise remain apart. That idea does not age. Every society needs it. Every person experiences it. Crossing a river is an ancient act, repeated endlessly. That is why forgotten bridges still matter. They remind us that history is not always grand or glorious. Sometimes it is just the act of carrying someone safely to the other side. Many of these bridges are still in use today. Farmers lead cattle across them. Children walk to school over them. Tourists photograph them without realizing they are still part of living infrastructure. Others have been bypassed by modern highways, but remain as heritage sites. Moss grows on their stones, plaques mark their age, and guides tell their stories. What was once boring utility has become, with time, a relic worth protecting. It is ironic. The bridges built only to serve now endure as monuments, while the monuments built to impress have often crumbled. Stand on such a bridge today, and you may feel its stones beneath your shoes. Smooth, uneven, worn by centuries of feet. Look over the side, and you see water flowing just as it did for the builders. Hear the rumble of traffic or the silence of a forgotten lane. You are part of a chain stretching backward. Every step on that bridge echoes thousands of others. The builders are gone. The empires that funded them are dust. But the stones remain, carrying you as they carried everyone else. And so you walk on, leaving the bridge behind, but it stays, patient, silent, unremarkable. And you wonder, When our own bridges are centuries old, will they still carry the world, or will they crumble because no one bothered to care for them? If you hold a clay tablet in your hand today, it looks unremarkable. A palm-sized rectangle of hardened mud, its surface scored with tiny wedge-shaped impressions. There is no color, no beauty, no obvious importance. And yet, this dull object is one of the most revolutionary tools ever created. Clay tablets were the world's first filing cabinets, the first bureaucratic ledgers, the first libraries. They were the medium through which writing itself was born. Civilizations rose not only on bronze and plows, but on mud scratched with signs. It is hard to imagine a more boring invention, but in its boredom lay the power to record, to count, to govern, and to remember. Around 5,000 years ago, in Mesopotamia, the land between the Tigris and Euphrates, scribes began pressing marks into wet clay with reed styluses. At first, they recorded only numbers: sacks of grain, flocks of sheep, jars of beer. Tokens once used to represent goods were replaced by marks impressed into tablets. Over time, the marks evolved into cuneiform, wedge-shaped signs that represented not just numbers but sounds, names, and eventually full sentences. Imagine the scene. A scribe sits cross-legged in the dust, tablet on his lap, stylus in hand. He presses wedge after wedge into the clay, the sun beating down, his hand cramping. He is not writing poetry. He is tallying rations, recording debts, filing receipts. And yet, in this dull act, writing itself is born. The majority of clay tablets were not epic myths or royal inscriptions. They were bureaucratic paperwork. Receipts, contracts, accounts, lists of workers, and wages. A tablet might record that one farmer delivered 10 jars of beer to a temple. Another might note that a worker was absent 3 days. Another might list the rations for slaves or soldiers. Thousands upon thousands of these survive because clay, once baked, is nearly indestructible. The result is a vast archive of boring details that outlasted kings. To us, they may feel tedious, but for the ancient world, they were revolutionary. Memory made permanent. By the first millennium BCE, clay tablets filled great libraries. The most famous was at Nineveh, where King Ashurbanipal collected texts on history, medicine, astronomy, and magic. His library contained tens of thousands of tablets. When Nineveh fell in 612 BCE, fire swept the palace. But instead of destroying the tablets, the heat baked them harder. They survived the city's fall. And so, today, you can still read Gilgamesh's story, Babylonian star charts, and Assyrian medical recipes, all because someone once filed them away in clay. Imagine that. While palaces burned and kings were slaughtered, the filing system of mud endured. But most tablets were not for kings. They were for ordinary transactions. Imagine a farmer bringing goats to market. He agrees to trade them for barley. A scribe sits nearby, scratching the agreement into clay. The farmer cannot read, but he trusts the record. Tomorrow or next year, when disputes arise, the tablet will speak for him. This was writing not as art, but as utility. It was dull, functional, and absolutely necessary. Clay was cheap, but it was heavy. Archives became mountains of mud. Palaces stored them in bins, shelves, and baskets. Scribes spent their lives cataloging and referencing them. To walk into an archive was to face not beauty but monotony. Endless rows of gray rectangles, each scratched with wedges. And yet, within this mountain of boredom lay civilization's memory. Laws, treaties, trade records, hymns. All were pressed into clay and left for time to guard. So you picture a scribe setting down his stylus at dusk, stretching cramped fingers, leaving yet another tablet to dry in the sun. He has not written poetry or history, only a record of barley delivered or wages owed. Yet his tablet may survive for 5,000 years, while the names of kings fade. And you wonder, is civilization built on the brilliance of its art or on the boredom of its records? A clay tablet may seem simple, but the ability to create it was not. Writing was a specialized skill, and those who mastered it, scribes, formed one of the earliest bureaucratic classes. From childhood, young boys and occasionally girls were trained in the tablet house, learning to cut styluses from reeds, to press straight wedges, to memorize hundreds of signs. Their lessons were dull, endless lists, copied again and again, until the signs became second nature. When they graduated, they became servants of temples, palaces, or merchants. Their job was not glamorous. Day after day, their recorded rations tallied debts, inscribed contracts. Yet without them, the state itself would have collapsed. Imagine the storerooms of Uruk or Babylon, shelves stacked with baskets, each filled with tablets. Some were grouped by year, others by subject. Livestock accounts here, grain rations there, temple offerings in another section. It was not efficient by modern standards, but it worked. A temple priest could pull a tablet to confirm who owed what. A merchant could retrieve a contract written years before. The state could check taxes. Civilization itself became, in essence, a mountain of mud, filed, cataloged, and referenced. Consider the daily life of a palace scribe. He arrives at dawn, reads stylus tucked into his belt. His desk is not wood, but his lap, or perhaps a clay board. A clerk brings him lists. Record 10 sheep delivered to the temple, 3 jars of oil received, 2 workers absent. He presses each wedge carefully. By noon, his fingers ache. By evening, he has created half a dozen tablets. He places them on a shelf, where they will dry and harden. Tomorrow, he will do the same again. And again, and again. It is tedium incarnate. Yet it is also order. Through these repetitive acts, chaos became administration. Tablets were more than receipts. They were contracts, laws, promises fixed in earth. A farmer might borrow silver from a neighbor. The scribe would record the loan, the repayment terms, and the witnesses. Once dried, the tablet became binding. In disputes, judges consulted these tablets. The clay does not lie. They might say, memory could falter, men could deceive, but the baked mud held steady. The boring solidity of clay became the foundation of justice. But clay had limits. Tablets could break, be lost, or erode in floods. To prevent this, scribes often made duplicates, storing copies in different archives. Some libraries kept reference catalogs listing the first line of each tablet, an early form of metadata. Again, it is tedious work. But through this dull redundancy, knowledge survived longer than empires. When you read a clay tablet today in a museum, you hear not the voice of kings, but of clerks. 20 sheep delivered to the temple of Inanna, signed by Uarnamu. Or 3 days' wages paid to the workers of Canal. It is not exciting, but it is honest. These are the voices of ordinary life, preserved by boredom. They tell us more about ancient survival than any epic or myth. So you picture the scribe, setting aside his stylus, shelves filled with tablets around him. He does not know that his records will survive 5,000 years. He does not imagine future scholars reading his dull tallies. And you ask yourself, is the true voice of history found in its heroes, or in the clerks who quietly wrote down every loaf, every sheep, every jar? Most tablets were dull records, but among them emerged something more enduring. Scribes, having mastered the art of writing, turned their tools to epic stories, prayers, and laws. The Epic of Gilgamesh, one of the oldest known works of literature, was pressed into clay around 2100 BCE. Hammurabi's laws, carved first in stone, were also copied onto tablets. Thus, the same medium that recorded sheep and jars of beer also carried humanity's earliest poetry, justice, and philosophy. The filing system of mud became the library of civilization. Ashurbanipal's library in Nineveh is the most famous example. Among its thousands of tablets lay myths, star charts, omens, and rituals. When archaeologists uncovered them in the 19th century, the tablets spoke again after 2,500 years of silence. These were not glamorous objects. They were lumps of hardened earth, scratched with wedges, yet they contained entire cosmologies, the seeds of mathematics, and the rhythms of prayer. It is astonishing to think that civilization's memory rested not on gold, but on mud. Clay is fragile, yet paradoxically, it endures better than many other materials. Papyrus rots, parchment burns, ink fades, but once baked by accident of fire or deliberately in a kiln, clay hardens forever. This is why so much of Mesopotamia's voice survives. Palaces burned, but their archives baked in the flames. What was tragedy for kings was salvation for history. And so, Today, in glass cases, you can still see contracts, letters, even school exercises scratched by nervous students. The dullest fragments became the strongest survivors. The story of clay tablets is not one of brilliance, but of persistence. Thousands of scribes pressing wedges, day after day, created a continuity of memory that no single conqueror could erase. Think of it. When empires fell, when temples crumbled, when dynasties ended, the tablets remained. Boring, repetitive, weighty, but enduring. Civilization itself is often built on the dullest tools. Today, you no longer press reeds into mud. You tap on keyboards, swipe on screens, store terabytes in the cloud. The medium has changed, but the impulse is the same: to record, to preserve, to file. And just as we sift through clay tablets for ancient truths, perhaps one day future historians will sift through your emails, receipts, and ledgers. They will not read only the epics of your time. They will also read your boredom. So you stand in an archive of clay tablets, rows upon rows of gray slabs, each marked with wedges. They are silent, unremarkable, almost tedious. And yet they are the reason we know who the Sumerians were, how they lived, what they believed. And you wonder, is history's true foundation the brilliance of its ideas, or the dull endurance of mud pressed by countless forgotten hands? Stand in an ancient granary. The air is heavy, thick with dust. The scent is dry, earthy, a little sour. Before you stretch bins filled with wheat, barley, or millet. There is no beauty here, no mosaics, no arches, no glittering idols. Just piles of grain, measured in sacks and baskets. Yet this is where civilization was truly built. Armies march on bread. Cities live on rations. Temples collect offerings not only in gold, but in barley. The granary is dull. It is boring, and it is civilization's lifeblood. As soon as humans began farming in the Fertile Crescent around 10,000 years ago, they faced a problem. Abundance is useless unless it can be preserved. Harvests come once a year. Hunger comes every day. So early villages dug silos into the earth. Pits lined with clay or stone, sealed to keep out water and pests. Grain poured in after harvest could feed families for months. These dark, airless holes were not dramatic, but they were the difference between survival and collapse. As cities grew, granaries became state institutions. Temples in Mesopotamia did not only house gods, they also housed grain. Priests oversaw the storage, distribution, and rationing of barley. A clay tablet might record: 10 sacks received, 5 sacks distributed to workers, remainder sealed in storehouse. These dull records formed the backbone of urban life. Later, in Egypt, the state granaries became immense. Pharaohs taxed farmers in grain, storing it in tall mud brick silos. In years of famine, the stores could feed the people, though often they were used to feed armies or fund royal projects. The grain bin was, in truth, a treasury. Gold glittered, but bread sustained. Storing grain was never simple. Moisture made it rot. Insects burrowed through it. Rats gnawed sacks, leaving trails of droppings. Mold crept in silently. So ancient engineers developed systems of ventilation, small holes in silo walls, raised floors in warehouses, stone-lined bins to keep out rodents. The fight against spoilage was constant, dull, and absolutely necessary. Imagine a worker in a pharaonic granary, sweeping floors each morning, patching cracks in bins, checking for damp. His labor was not glorious, but it prevented hunger for thousands. Control the granary, and you control the people. In many cultures, rulers stored grain not only as food, but as leverage. During shortages, the granary decided who ate and who starved. During wars, it fed armies. In China, the Han Dynasty built vast state granaries. Officials recorded harvests, set aside reserves, and released grain to stabilize markets. The system was bureaucratic and boring, but it softened famine and kept the empire steady. In medieval Europe, lords demanded grain tithes, filling their barns from peasant harvests. Those barns became both wealth and weapon. For the average person, granaries meant labor. Harvests had to be threshed, winnowed, dried, and carried to storage. Families hauled sacks. Workers shoveled heaps. Overseers counted measures. The grain itself was monotonous. Kernel after kernel, sack after sack. Yet in those endless heaps lay the bread of the year. Each sack was a season's survival sealed in dust. So you stand at the mouth of a stone granary, staring into its dark, dry interior. The air is heavy with old grain. It does not dazzle you. It does not inspire awe, but it holds life itself. And you wonder, were civilizations truly built on kings and conquests, or on the silent, dusty mountains of seed that kept hunger away? Grain may look inert, but it is never still. Moisture creeps in, kernels sweat, insects hatch, rodents gnaw. A full silo is not a treasure that can simply be sealed and forgotten. It is a living mass, always threatening to rot. And so, keeping grain meant constant vigilance. Workers swept bins daily, patched cracks, shoveled piles to aerate them. Guards stood watch, not just against thieves, but against rats and sparrows. The daily work of preservation was dull, repetitive, and invisible, yet in it lay the line between plenty and famine. Few enemies of civilization are as underestimated as the rat. In Egypt, Assyria, and Rome alike, rodents chewed through sacks and silos, spilling grain onto floors. Cats were treasured not as pets, but as soldiers in this endless war. Picture a granary floor at night. Shadows moving, tails flashing, tiny jaws working. A worker sets traps, releases cats, beats on the walls. He wins small victories, but never the war. Each day, the rats return. The dull battle between men and vermin decided whether armies marched and cities survived. Moisture was equally dangerous. A single damp corner could spread mold through an entire store. The smell of rot meant disaster. Bread baked from spoiled grain could sicken or kill. Ancient granary keepers developed rituals as well as techniques. Offerings were made to gods for dry seasons. Prayers whispered to keep stores safe. For them, spoilage was not just economic loss. It was a shadow of death. Granaries also generated endless paperwork. Clay tablets in Mesopotamia, papyrus in Egypt, parchment in medieval Europe, all filled with entries of grain received and grain distributed. 10 sacks delivered. 5 sacks issued to temple workers. 2 sacks spoiled. Balance remaining 3. The records may seem dull, but they were the heartbeat of the state. Without them, taxes could not be levied, armies could not be fed, famine could not be prevented. Control of granaries often meant control of people. In times of revolt, rulers withheld grain, starving rebels into submission. In times of loyalty, they opened stores, feeding cities and gaining gratitude. Grain was more than food. It was leverage. And the granary, though it looked like nothing more than a dull warehouse, was as political as any throne. Imagine yourself as a granary keeper in pharaonic Egypt. Each morning, you check the bins for damp. You measure levels with a staff, record numbers on a shard of pottery, shout instructions to workers. By midday, you inspect guards at the door. By evening, you shoo cats into the storage rooms. The work is tedious. No one sings songs about granary keepers. But when famine comes, all eyes turn to you. If the bins are full and safe, you are a savior. If they are empty or spoiled, you are cursed. The most terrifying sight in history may not be the battlefield, but the empty granary. Civilizations knew this fear intimately. A bad harvest, a failed shipment, a plague of rats, and suddenly bins stood hollow, walls echoing. Empty granaries meant hunger. Hunger meant revolt. Revolt meant collapse. And so, year after year, the dull work of keeping them full became the true insurance of stability. And so you picture the granary again. Dark, dusty, guarded by cats, watched by tired keepers. It is not majestic. It is not inspiring. But it decides whether people live or die. And you wonder, is true power the sword in a king's hand, or the key that locks a granary door? If you trace the strength of ancient empires, you often find it measured not only in armies or gold, but in the fullness of their granaries. Pharaohs of Egypt built their authority on Nile harvests stored in vast mud brick silos. Chinese emperors commanded networks of state granaries that fed millions. Even Rome, with its vast territory, survived by importing and storing grain from Africa and Sicily. The granary was not just a warehouse. It was a throne made of dust. Whoever held the keys held the empire. History shows again and again that empty bins ignite rebellion. When grain prices soared in Rome, mobs flooded the Forum. When the French Revolution erupted, one of the first cries was for bread. In China, peasant uprisings often followed shortages in state stores. People could tolerate taxes, wars, and kings, but they could not tolerate hunger. And hunger came when the granaries failed. It is a lesson written not in grand speeches but in silence. An empty storehouse can topple a kingdom more surely than invading armies. Many cultures sacralized grain storage. Temples doubled as granaries. Priests became keepers of both gods and food. Offerings of barley, wheat, and millet were stacked not only as tribute, but as insurance. Even today, phrases like daily bread carry echoes of these ancient fears. Faith itself grew around the rhythm of harvest and storage, prayer and famine. Granaries did not vanish with the ancients. They simply changed form. In the 19th and 20th centuries, towering steel silos rose in farm towns across the world, replacing clay pits and stone bins. Today, computerized elevators, climate-controlled warehouses, and global shipping routes serve the same function, keeping harvest steady, preventing rot, ensuring bread on tables. Yet the fear remains. Food shortages still spark unrest. Empty shelves echo the same terror as empty silos. Civilization still stands on the dullest of foundations, stored calories. Behind every full storehouse lies invisible work. Farmers harvesting, haulers carrying, clerks recording, workers patching leaks. None of it glamorous. None of it celebrated. Yet all of it vital. Just as ancient granary keepers fought rats with cats, modern workers check silo temperatures, repair augers, and monitor grain shipments. The tools change. The boredom remains. And with it, survival. Picture yourself inside a granary, whether mud brick in Egypt, stone-lined in China, or steel-towered in Kansas. Around you lies the same essence. Mountains of seed, each kernel holding the promise of survival. It is not beautiful. It is not inspiring. But it is everything. Civilizations do not collapse when statues topple or palaces burn. They collapse when storehouses empty. And so you look once more into the dusty dark of the granary. It is silent, heavy, dull. But in its silence lies the fate of nations. And you wonder, is history written by kings and generals or by the quiet, unseen hands that kept the bins from going empty? For most of human history, night was a wall. When the sun went down, life shrank to shadows. Work stopped, travel ceased, streets emptied. Fire was the only defense, a hearth, a torch, or more often, a candle. Today, you flick a switch and banish darkness instantly. But for medieval peasants, Roman households, or even kings and palaces, light came from slow-burning sticks of wax or tallow. They sputtered, smoked, and dripped. They stank, but they gave what was most precious, hours after sunset. At its simplest, a candle was just fuel and wick. The wick, twisted fibers of flax, hemp, or cotton. The fuel, fat or wax. Tallow candles were the cheapest, made from rendered animal fat. They smoked heavily and smelled of grease. In a crowded room, the stench clung to clothes and walls. Beeswax candles were cleaner, sweeter smelling, and brighter, but expensive. Only churches and the wealthy could afford to burn them nightly. The difference between classes could be seen, quite literally, in the light. Candle making was a craft, often handled by chandlers. In workshops that stank of boiling fat, they rendered tallow in cauldrons, dipping wicks repeatedly until they thickened into candles. The process was monotonous. Dip, cool, dip again. Hours of repetition, dozens of dips for each candle. The smell was foul. Tallow chandlers were often placed on the edge of towns because neighbors could not tolerate the stench. Yet their work was indispensable. Without them, streets would be darker, churches dimmer, homes bound tighter to daylight. Candles held not only practical value, but spiritual meaning. In churches, beeswax candles burned before altars, their light seen as prayer rising to heaven. Cathedrals consumed them by the thousands. The cost was enormous. Entire beekeeping industries grew to supply ecclesiastical demand. Monasteries kept hives not only for honey, but for wax. Each taper that flickered before a saint's statue represented both devotion and wealth. Light was power, and those who controlled the supply of candles controlled ritual itself. In an ordinary home, however, light was meager. A peasant family might have only a few tallow candles, saved for necessity. Evenings were spent in dim half-light. Families huddled near the hearth, work that required sight. Weaving, sewing, reading, strained eyes, or ceased altogether. The wealthy fared better. Their halls might blaze with dozens of candles, chandeliers dripping wax. But even then, smoke-stained ceilings, wax dripped on the floors, and the effort of constantly replacing candles never ended. To live by candlelight was to live in constant negotiation with darkness. And so you imagine the medieval evening. The chandler's greasy tapers sputter in cottages. In abbeys, golden beeswax flames flicker before statues. In palaces, chandeliers glow while servants scurry to trim wicks and replace stubs. And you wonder, was candlelight a symbol of progress, or a reminder of how fragile civilization remained in the face of night? Step into a medieval chandler's workshop. The air is thick, greasy, almost nauseating. Cauldrons bubble with rendered fat, steam rising in sour waves. The floor is sticky, the table streaked with wax drippings. Apprentices dip wicks into vats of hot tallow, pull them out, let them cool, then dip again. Dozens of times they repeat this motion. The room smells of slaughterhouses, for tallow came from the leftover fat of cattle, sheep, or pigs. Every candle carried with it the ghosts of animals butchered for meat. It was not glamorous work. It was hot, smelly, repetitive, yet it was essential. Without chandlers, nights would shrink back into darkness. In contrast, beeswax candles were cleaner and brighter. Their honeyed scent filled cathedrals and noble halls. But producing them required vast networks of hives. Beekeeping was laborious. Tending hives, collecting combs, melting wax, straining impurities. The church claimed much of supply. Monasteries kept apiaries. Bishops ordered wax by the cartload. Abbeys measured their wealth in the number of candles they could burn during a festival. For peasants, beeswax was out of reach. They lived by the greasy flame of tallow, while their lords prayed by golden light. The candle became a marker of class, a literal line between smoky poverty and fragrant wealth. Behind every candle burned centuries of labor chains. Butchers provided fat. Farmers tended animals. Beekeepers maintained hives. Carters hauled barrels of tallow. Apprentices stirred vats, dipped wicks, poured molds. Candles did not simply appear on tables. They were the result of entire industries, boring and repetitive, scattered across towns and countrysides. Every flickering flame was a web of hidden toil. In many towns, guilds of chandlers regulated production. Prices were fixed, quality checked, apprenticeships tightly controlled. The guilds had power, for they controlled the night. Imagine a city council chamber debating how many candles would be provided for street lighting, or a cathedral chapter arguing over the expense of wax for Easter Mass. These discussions were not romantic. They were tedious budgets and ledgers. But through them, society decided how much of the night it could push back. Light itself became an economy. For those who made candles, the labor was endless. A chandler's apprentice might spend hours carrying buckets of fat, stirring vats, or straightening cool candles on racks. His hands blistered, his clothes reeked, his lungs filled with smoke. He was never celebrated, but his work shaped every evening. When nobles feasted, when monks prayed, when families ate by firelight, they did so because someone endured the stink and tedium of boiling fat. So you picture the flickering glow of a candle in a medieval hall. Beneath its soft light lies the sweat of apprentices, the blood of animals, the hum of bees, the rules of guilds. And you wonder, was candlelight truly a symbol of civilization's triumph, or just the smell of labor hidden behind the glow? By the 18th and 19th centuries, candles began to lose their monopoly on the night. Whale oil lamps, then kerosene, then gas lighting pushed their way into streets and homes. The arrival of electricity in the late 19th century sealed the transition. Candles, one civilization's lifeline, were demoted. They no longer dictated how long a family could read after sunset or how brightly a church could glow during Mass. Their reign had lasted millennia, But now it was fading. What had been survival became luxury. Before they fully lost their throne, candles went through one last transformation. In the 19th century, paraffin wax, refined from petroleum, replaced tallow and beeswax for most households. It was cheaper, burned cleaner, and carried no slaughterhouse stench. Factories mass-produced them by the thousands. Candlelight, once a symbol of privilege or devotion, became ordinary. For the first time, nearly anyone could afford to fill their home with steady, sweet-smelling light. And yet, just as candles reached their widest spread, electricity rendered them obsolete. The empire of flame gave way to the empire of wires. But candles never vanished. Instead, they migrated into ritual and memory. In churches, they still flicker before altars, their beeswax glow carrying prayers heavenward. In homes, they were lit at dinners, vigils, and festivals. In cemeteries, candles burned beside graves. Light had moved on to bulbs and gas lamps. But the candle retained a different power. Intimacy, symbolism, the sense of presence in darkness. Think of a candlelit dinner. The flame is no longer needed to see your food. The room could be flooded with electric light. But the candle's flicker makes the moment slower, gentler, older. Or think of a vigil, hundreds of people holding candles in silence. Each flame is small, fragile, yet together they carry weight beyond their size. Candles stopped being tools and became metaphors, for hope, for memory, for faith. The Chandler's smelly workshops are gone, the guilds dissolved, the vats of boiling fat replaced by factories of paraffin. But candles are still everywhere. On birthday cakes, in churches, in spas, on dinner tables. They are no longer survival's backbone. They are atmosphere, tradition, ritual. They remind us of what life once was. Fragile light held against endless night. Picture a single candle burning in a dark room. Its light wavers, its wax drips, its wick glows red. Around it lies silence. It no longer stands between hunger and survival, but it still whispers of centuries when it did. Each flicker carries echoes of monks in cathedrals, peasants at supper, chandlers at their vats. The candle survives, not as power, but as memory. And so you blow out the candle, leaving only smoke curling into the dark. And you wonder, does the flame survive in our rituals because we love its glow, or because we fear forgetting the darkness it once held at bay? For most of human history, labor meant muscle. The bent backs of farmers, the straining arms of slaves, the weary steps of oxen pulling carts. Work ended when strength gave out. But somewhere in the ancient world, someone looked at a stream and realized the river never tires. The invention of the water wheel was, in its way, a quiet revolution. Unlike iron weapons or marble temples, it did not change the world overnight, but slowly, steadily, it shifted the balance of labor. A wheel turning in a stream to grind grain, pound cloth, or sawwood, without a man lifting a finger. It was not glamorous. It was creaky, wet, and monotonous, but it was civilization's first great machine. The earliest and most common use of water wheels was grinding grain. Bread was the foundation of medieval diets, and grinding was exhausting work. Hand mills were slow, rotary querns backbreaking, but attach a millstone to a water wheel, and suddenly the river did the labor. Grain poured between stones, flour spilled out. A job that once consumed hours of human effort became the task of a stream. Imagine the sound. The splash of water, the creak of wood, the steady rumble of stones turning. Day and night, the wheel worked while men rested. Life around the mill was dull routine. Farmers carried sacks of grain to the door, waiting as millers poured it into hoppers. The wheel turned, the stones ground, the flour collected. The process was mechanical, repetitive, noisy. Millers were often mistrusted, accused of taking too much flour as payment. But their work was essential. Villages depended on them as much as on priests or blacksmiths. The mill was not glamorous, but it was indispensable. Over time, water wheels found other uses. They powered hammers and ironworks, bellows and forges, fulling mills for cloth, sawmills for timber. A stream that once watered fields now drove industries. The beauty of the water wheel was its constancy. Unlike animals, it did not tire. Unlike men, it did not complain. It simply turned hour after hour as long as water flowed. It was, in a sense, the first taste of automation. Water wheels became part of the scenery of medieval Europe. Travelers crossing valleys saw them perched on streams, half hidden by trees, their paddles turning lazily. Villages gathered around them, for where there was a mill, there was bread. The wheel became almost invisible, its presence assumed. Yet without it, life would have slowed, diets worsened, and industry stalled. Few chroniclers praised the water wheel. Kings celebrated battles. Monks wrote of miracles. Poets sang of love. No one sang of creaky wheels grinding wheat. And yet, historians today recognize its quiet power. The water wheel multiplied labor, freed workers for other tasks, and laid the groundwork for later machines. It was not spectacular, but it was transformative. And so you stand by a stream in your imagination, watching a wooden wheel turn slowly, paddles splashing, gears creaking. It is not impressive. It is not beautiful, but it works day after day, year after year. And you wonder, was it grand inventions that carried civilization forward, or the quiet, monotonous ones that no one bothered to praise? Step into a medieval mill. The air is thick with flour dust, coating hair and clothes. The sound is constant. The creak of the wheel, the groan of gears, the grind of millstones. Light filters dimly through narrow windows, catching the haze. The work here is not heroic. It is repetitive, mechanical, and dirty. Grain comes in sacks, is poured into hoppers, ground to flour, then collected in bins. Millers weigh it, measure it, and always skim a portion for themselves. The villagers grumble about millers, accusing them of dishonesty, but no village can live without them. Bread depends on flour, and flour depends on the wheel. A miller's life is tied to the water. He rises at dawn, checks the stream, clears debris from the wheel. If the river runs high, the wheel turns fast. If it runs low, the grinding slows. In drought, the wheel may stop entirely. He spends his day adjusting gears, feeding grain, collecting flour. His hands are rough, his lungs choked with dust, his clothes stiff with sweat and meal. He works not in silence, but in constant noise. It is an unglamorous existence, but it is steady. In good years, millers were among the better-fed villagers, their payment taken in grain. Water wheels break, wooden paddles crack, axles were down, stones chip, floods rip apart gears. Each repair demands labor, hauling beams, carving replacements, fitting joints. A miller must be part engineer, part carpenter, part blacksmith. He cannot simply operate the mill. He must constantly mend it. Picture him waist deep in cold water, hammering a paddle back into place, mud sucking at his boots, or perched on scaffolding, greasing a gear with animal fat. The wheel works because he never stops fixing it. A failed mill was disaster. Without flour, bread vanished. Without bread, hunger spread. Villages often built multiple mills along a stream, just in case one broke. Towns taxed mills. Lords claimed rights to them. Monasteries built them as sources of income. The mill was not just machinery. It was wealth, politics, and survival all turning together. And yet, for all its importance, it was boring. Nothing but a wheel splashing endlessly, a stone grinding endlessly, a man repeating endless tasks. It is easy, centuries later, to marvel at cathedrals or castles. But in truth, those grand buildings were sustained by the quiet work of mills. The bread that fed masons and builders was ground by water. The cloth they wore was fulled by water. Even the iron tools they used may have been shaped by water-powered hammers. The wheel, dull and monotonous, was the unseen engine of medieval life. So you stand again beside the mill. The water flows, the wheel creaks, the stones grind. A farmer waits with his sack. A miller shouts over the noise. Dust floats in the air. It is ordinary, forgettable, yet everything depends on it. And you wonder, was it kings who built the Middle Ages, or the millers who kept the wheels from stopping? By the later Middle Ages, water wheels had spread across Europe and Asia, powering more than just mills for flour. They hammered iron, sawed timber, crushed ores, pressed oil, and pumped water. Entire industries clustered along streams. Villages grew into towns where rivers could turn many wheels. A valley of quiet creeks became a valley of industry. No trumpets announced this change. It was steady, boring, creaky, but transformative. The water wheel was, in essence, the ancestor of the factory machine. Its constant motion, transferred through gears and shafts, inspired later inventors. When steam power arrived in the 18th century, it replaced water not because water wheels failed, but because they were too tied to rivers. But the principle remained: let machines work while men rest. In that sense, the sleepy water wheel was the first hum of the industrial age. Today, you may walk past ruins of a mill, a mossy stone foundation, a gap in the wall where a wheel once turned, a stream flowing silently by. It is easy to ignore, but in those ruins lie centuries of labor, survival, and innovation. Without wheels grinding flour, there would be no bread for armies, no food for towns. Without wheels hammering iron, there would be no tools, no weapons, no bridges. Without wheels fulling cloth, there would be no markets. The great stories of knights, kings, and cathedrals all lean quietly on the dull creak of water wheels. Though replaced by turbines and engines, water wheels still exist. Some turn slowly in rural villages, powering small mills. Others survive as tourist curiosities, spinning lazily for photographs. They seem quaint, almost decorative, but each one is a reminder of a time when flowing streams power the world. Picture yourself standing by an old mill. The wheel turns slowly, moss clinging to its paddles. The stream gurgles, indifferent. The building leans, its stones damp and worn. It does not impress. It does not awe, but it whispers. Here, once, the world turned forward one creak at a time. And so you leave the mill behind, the sound of water fading. And you wonder, is progress born in revolutions or in the slow, steady turning of wheels that no one bothered to praise? Walk the streets of London in any century, and beneath your feet lies a second city, a city of tunnels, pipes, and drains. Few notice it, fewer praise it, but without it, London would not survive. The story of London's sewers is not one of single construction, but of endless rebuilding, layer after layer, repair after repair, as the city grew, rotted, and demanded more. The monument above ground, St. Paul's Cathedral, the Tower of Parliament, depended on this silent, stinking network below. It is, in truth, the most boring of infrastructures, and the most vital. In the Middle Ages, Londoners had little in the way of organized sewers. Waste poured into open ditches, cesspits, and streams. The Fleet River, once a lively waterway, became an open sewer, choked with refuse. Imagine the stench in summer. Dung, offal, dead animals, human waste, all festering in the heat. Disease spread easily. Outbreaks of plague found fuel and filth. The city tried to cope. Ditches were dug, pits emptied, channels widened. But London kept growing, and its waste kept overflowing. The story of the sewers is a story of endless catching up. By the 14th century, London began covering streams and digging drains beneath streets. Brick-lined channels carried filth away, at least in theory. In practice, they clogged constantly. Workers with shovels had to climb down, scraping muck, hauling it out, repairing collapsed walls. It was unglamorous, dangerous work. Men suffocated in fumes, drowned in sudden floods, or fell ill from the stench. But without them, streets would flood with waste. The city above rarely thought of these men. They labored in silence, forgotten, yet they carried civilization on their shoulders. As London expanded in the 16th and 17th centuries, so did its underground maze. More drains were dug, more cesspits linked to channels, more rivers covered over. Each time, the system seemed adequate. Each time, it failed within decades. The Thames itself became the final sewer, carrying the city's waste downstream. But by the 18th century, it too was overwhelmed. The river reeked. Fish died. Water drawn for drinking was poisoned. The city was, in effect, drowning in its own filth. And still, the rebuilding continued. Stand in 18th century London. Above you, coaches rattle, markets buzz, bells ring. Beneath you, unseen, brick tunnels curve and twist. filled with dark water and worse. Workers slosh knee-deep in sludge, repairing leaks, hauling rubble, cursing their endless task. This is a true foundation of the city, not its palaces or banks, but its drains. And so you walk the streets, breathing the London air. You may see grand buildings, bustling shops, crowded taverns. But the real lifeline lies below, where no one looks. And you wonder, is a city measured by its monuments or by the filth it quietly carries away? By the mid-19th century, London had become the largest city in the world and the filthiest. Over 2 million people emptied their waste into cesspits and drains that led, ultimately, to the Thames. Factories dumped chemicals, slaughterhouses bled carcasses, breweries spilled dregs. The Thames became a ribbon of rot. Its water, still drawn for drinking, was brown, bubbling, and foul. Outbreaks of cholera swept through the city, killing tens of thousands. Doctors argued about causes. Some blamed miasmas of bad air, others suspected water itself. But all agreed the river was a disaster. In the summer of 1858, a heat wave baked the Thames until its stench overwhelmed the city. Parliament itself, perched on the riverbank, was nearly uninhabitable. Curtains were soaked in chloride of lime to mask the odor, but it was useless. Londoners called it the Great Stink. Newspapers screamed, politicians gagged, citizens despaired. Finally, something that had been ignored for centuries became impossible to deny. The sewers had to be rebuilt. The task fell to engineer Joseph Bazalgette. His solution was massive, tedious, and brilliant. A network of intercepting sewers that would collect waste before it reached the Thames and carry it east, far beyond the city. It required miles of brick tunnels, pumping stations, embankments along the river. Tens of thousands of workers dug, bricked, and hauled, often in choking conditions underground. The work was not glamorous. There were no grand speeches in the tunnels, no parades for bricklayers, just endless mud, sweat, and the stink of sewage. But brick by brick, they reshaped London's hidden city. Consider the numbers. More than 318 million bricks were laid for the new sewers. Each brick handled by hand, set in place, sealed with mortar. Thousands of tons of cement, iron, and granite were moved. Imagine the monotony of laborers in the tunnels. Torchlight flickering, water dripping, the echo of hammers on stone. For years, this dull underground labor consumed the city's workforce. Above ground, life continued. Below ground, civilization's veins were being rebuilt. By the 1870s, Bazalgette's system was complete. The stench eased, cholera outbreaks ended, the Thames slowly cleared. London could breathe again. Yet the new sewers were invisible. Tourists admired Big Ben, not the intercepting sewers beneath their feet. Politicians boasted of empire, not of drains. The triumph of engineering was buried underground, a victory of boredom over chaos. Bazalgette himself understood. When asked about the size of his tunnels, he explained that he had built them twice as large as needed, to serve future generations. His foresight meant that, even today, much of London still relies on his 19th century network. That foresight was not dramatic. It was patience, planning, and endless labor, the kind of work that never makes headlines, but keeps cities alive for centuries. So you stand on the embankment of the Thames. The Houses of Parliament rise behind you. Tourists chatter nearby. Boats pass on the water. Few look down. Few imagine the rivers of sewage flowing silently through brick channels below. And you wonder, is true greatness in the monuments above or in the silent networks beneath, rebuilt endlessly so that no one has to notice? When you walk through London today, across Westminster Bridge, past the Tower, along Fleet Street, you rarely think of the world beneath. Yet Bazalgette's tunnels still carry away the waste of millions. Without them, the city would collapse within days. It is a strange truth. London is not held together by parliament or palaces, but by brick tunnels buried in mud. Civilization depends not on what dazzles the eye, but on what hides from it. Even Bazalgette's genius was not the end. As the city grew, the sewers strained again. New tunnels were added, pumping stations rebuilt, treatment plants expanded. Each generation of engineers took up the same dull task. More digging, more bricking, more pumping. There is never a final sewer. They must always be mended, expanded, modernized. The system is a living organism, one that constantly requires boring maintenance. Its survival depends not on brilliance, but on endless, repetitive care. Think of what the sewers prevented: epidemics of cholera, typhoid, dysentery. Think of what they enabled: crowded cities, industries, modern life itself. Without drains, urban life is impossible. And yet, they are never celebrated. No poet writes odes to sewer workers. No statues honor bricklayers in the tunnels. Their reward is only silence, a city above that forgets them. But in that forgetting lies a proof of success. The best sewer is the one you never notice. Even today, London invests billions in its sewers. The Thames Tideway Tunnel, dubbed the Super Sewer, is a 21st century echo of Bazalgette's vision, another massive boring project beneath the river. Again, bricklayers and engineers labor in tunnels no tourist will ever see. Again, the city survives because of their dull persistence. It is a reminder that progress is not only electricity, skyscrapers, or technology. It is also pipes, drains, and the people who descend into darkness so that others can walk in light. Picture yourself standing on the Thames embankment at dusk. Lights flicker across the water. Buses rumble by. Crowds hurry along the pavement. Beneath it all, sewage flows silently through brick tunnels laid a century and a half ago. The city sparkles above, but it stands only because the filth is carried away below. And so you walk on, never seeing the sewers, never hearing them, never thinking of them. And yet they work. And you wonder, is civilization's survival owed to the grand visions of its leaders, or to the endless, boring work that no one wants to notice? Travel in the medieval and early modern world was exhausting, uncertain, and slow. Roads were muddy, horses tired, and nights on the open path were dangerous. Every traveler needed a place to rest, eat, and sleep. That place was the inn or tavern. At first glance, they seemed like nothing more than smoky halls filled with ale, stew, and snoring travelers. But inns became something more. The nodes of a network where messages could be passed, letters exchanged, and news carried along the roads. What started as simple rest stops grew into the backbone of Europe's first postal systems. Picture a roadside inn in 14th century England. The fire burns low, smoke clings to the rafters, and the air smells of ale, horse sweat, and frying onions. Merchants sit at one table, swapping stories of markets. Pilgrims share benches, their sandals dusty. A scribe traveling for a nobleman unpacks his satchel of letters, handing one to a rider heading in the same direction. No official system is in place, but then serves as an exchange. Letters, messages, and packages pass hand to hand, carried forward by whoever travels next. The process is haphazard, unreliable, and slow, but it is better than nothing. In a world without telegraphs or post offices, the tavern is a postbox. Ale was the draw, of course. Inns earned their keep by selling drink, meals, and beds. But with travelers constantly coming and going, they also became information markets. News of wars, rumors of kings, prices of grain, all passed from mouth to ear across wooden tables. Letters joined gossip as part of the traffic. A merchant might pay a rider to carry a note to the next town. A noble's courier might stop to rest, leaving messages for others to pick up. Over time, these casual exchanges hardened into expectation. The inn was where you went if you wanted to send a word along the road. By the late Middle Ages, kings realized the usefulness of this network. Royal couriers stayed at official inns, where horses could be changed, letters passed, and messages sent along quickly. These posting houses became essential to governance. The system remained uneven, always dependent on the infrastructure of ordinary inns. Without alehouses keeping fires burning and stables ready, couriers could not ride. Thus, the politics of kingdoms rested, in part, on smoky taverns where peasants drank and merchants argued over stew. By the 16th and 17th centuries, taverns in Europe often served openly as post offices. Signs advertised mail services. Riders stopped to collect and deliver letters. Customers left coins and sealed notes with innkeepers who promised to see them forwarded. It was not efficient. Letters might arrive weeks late, soaked in rain, or lost altogether. But compared to silence, It was miraculous. The tavern gave ordinary people a way to reach beyond their village. So you sit in a smoky tavern centuries ago, the floor sticky with ale, the benches crowded with strangers. At the far end, a rider takes a sealed note from a merchant, tucks it into his pouch, and mounts his horse at dawn. It is nothing official, nothing grand, but the letter will travel, the word will spread, the network will grow, and you wonder, was it kings who built the first postal systems, or innkeepers who simply kept the fires burning on the road? By the 16th century, the casual habit of leaving letters at taverns began to harden into structure. Certain inns became known as posting inns, guaranteed stops for couriers, stocked with fresh horses, food, and rest. Their signboards no longer advertised only ale, but also post. Innkeepers took on new roles. They were not only hosts, but also custodians of letters, keepers of waybills, managers of stables. A rider could arrive at midnight, hand over a letter, switch to a fresh horse, and be off within minutes. The rhythm of kingdoms depended on the punctuality of tavern yards. Speed meant horses, and horses meant cost. Postal routes relied on a chain of inns where mounts could be swapped. Each stop required stables, fodder, farriers, and stable boys who slept in the straw. Picture a tired courier thundering into a yard, mud splashing, horse heaving with breath. Boys rush out, reins are exchanged, a new horse saddled, and within moments the rider is gone again. It is not dramatic, just the dull efficiency of repetition. But it is a system, multiplied across hundreds of inns, that carried royal orders, trade contracts, and family news across nations. Inns also became sites of bureaucracy. Innkeepers recorded who left what, who carried it, and when it departed. Great leather-bound ledgers listed names, destinations, and fees. Errors could cause chaos. A missed entry meant a lost letter. An absent rider meant weeks of delay. The survival of communication rested not only on horses and riders, but on the neat handwriting of tired innkeepers scratching in candlelight. It was paperwork, monotonous and endless, and it kept entire kingdoms stitched together. Across Europe, states began formalizing what taverns had begun. In France, Louis XI established royal post routes in the 15th century, centered on inns with horse relays. In England, Henry VIII created the Royal Mail, again relying on taverns as posting houses. Merchants joined in. Trade letters, contracts, and bills of exchange all traveled along these routes. Without the alehouses, there would have been no financial web connecting cities. And still, the whole thing depended on the ordinary infrastructure of inns, beds, fodder, meals, and hosts willing to manage the flow of strangers and letters. Postal riders lived exhausting lives. They rose before dawn, saddled fresh mounts, carried bags heavy with letters, and rode through mud, rain, and snow. At each inn they stopped only long enough to drink ale, eat bread, and switch horses. There was no glory in their labor. No statues would honor them. But every royal decree, every merchant contract, every whispered love letter depended on their relentless repetition. It is worth noting that these inns were never pure. Alongside letters, they hosted drunken brawls, gambling, and gossip. News spread as fast by word of mouth as by sealed envelope. A merchant might send a letter to his partner, but that partner may already have heard the news from a traveling soldier at the same inn. The tavern was both post office and rumor mill, both bureaucracy and chaos. So you picture the scene. A posting in at dusk, horses stamping in the yard, couriers clattering in and out, innkeepers scratching ledgers, while inside, peasants drink and merchants boast. It is messy, noisy, ordinary. But out of this mess comes order, letters delivered, kingdoms connected.